I used to think the worst thing you could be in a corporate building was invisible. I was wrong. The worst thing you can be is visible only when something breaks. For most of my career, I lived in that strange corner of finance and compliance, where nobody really understands what you do, but everyone assumes you're slowing them down. Controls, reconciliations, access logs, timing mismatches. None of it makes for exciting meetings. None of it gets applause, but all of it keeps the lights on. My name isn't important. What matters is what they called me. The guy who builds unnecessary friction. I didn't argue. I let the results speak. For 6 years, not a single major incident hit our division. No fines, no unapproved transfers, no contract overrides slipping through at midnight. The board never thanked me, but legal knew. Audit knew. Even IT knew. They were the ones who saw the alerts before they were quietly resolved. So when the new COO arrived, polished suit, TED Talk voice, all charm and speed, I knew exactly what was coming before I heard a single sentence. He was one of those leaders who believed efficiency was the same as haste, and who thought experience was the same as resistance. He didn't even hide it. On his second week, he said during a town hall, "Our division is drowning in redundant controls." People clapped. I didn't. I had seen this play before. New leadership cut safety nets to show short-term savings, only to rebuild them later at 10 times the cost. But this time was different. He wasn't just cutting budgets. He was cutting the system I had built, piece by careful piece. It started small. A missing approval chain here, a shortened reconciliation schedule there, access logs streamlined into a single dashboard that nobody except me had ever opened. I documented everything: dates, times, requests, who signed, what justification they used, not to weaponize it, just because documentation was how I stayed sane in chaos. And the irony? My documentation was the biggest reason the system had never failed. I tried to warn him once, not dramatically, not politically, just a quiet conversation in his office. Before you disable the multi-layer access, you should know the risk level jumps dramatically without the secondary failsafe. He barely looked up from his tablet. "We trust our people," he said. "You build good things, but we don't need Fort Knox for one division." Trust, the most expensive word in any company. After that conversation, my role changed overnight. No meeting, no explanation, just an updated org chart and a new title that looked like a promotion until you read the responsibilities. They had cut my access, reassigned parts of my work, and pushed me into a corner where I supported operations instead of building controls for them. People whispered, "Did he mess something up? Why is he being moved? Is this part of the restructuring?" I didn't correct them. I didn't have the energy. But I knew this. When a company sidelines the one person who understands the guts of its systems, it's not strategy. It's negligence wearing a suit. Still, I kept watching. Even with limited access, I could see what they were turning off. The approval matrix, gone. The dual custody workflow, disabled. The automatic freeze triggers on high-risk changes, temporarily bypassed. All that remained was a single master login, a powerful one that was never meant to be used directly, only for system recovery. I flagged it in a note to IT. Not dramatic, just a professional concern about exposure. The ticket was closed 30 minutes later, with one sentence: "Change requested by COO. Approved." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen long after it dimmed. Not because I was surprised, I wasn't, but because I finally understood the real problem. They thought the system was built to slow them down. They never realized it was built to protect them from themselves. The silence in the office felt different after that. Not peaceful, not calm, just waiting. People went about their day, smiling, planning, hurrying, but I saw the gaps, the missing guardrails, the holes no one else noticed, the kind of holes where accidents don't just happen, they unfold. And here's the part I didn't tell anyone. I knew exactly how the system would fail. Not if, when. It wasn't paranoia. It was math. You remove enough barriers, and sooner or later, a single login, a single action, a single mistake becomes the weight that cracks the whole floor. And the night it finally happened, the night that one login brought the entire division to a dead stop, I wasn't surprised. But that night was only the beginning. The morning after the first incident, the office felt wrong in that quiet, humming way buildings do when something happened overnight and no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. Screens flickered, systems lagged, people refreshed dashboards like they were waiting for a pulse. No one looked at me, which was ironic because for years I had been the person everyone quietly messaged when something just felt off. But now, after they'd trimmed my role to the bone, I was the last person they wanted involved. A problem appearing right after the COO removed my controls. It was the kind of connection no one wanted to admit. I walked past operations. They were whispering around a frozen interface. Is it the vendor? No, the vendor says their logs are normal. Then why can't we process anything? I didn't stop. I didn't volunteer. I just made mental notes, the way I always did, because it wasn't the vendor. It wasn't the network. It wasn't some random glitch. I'd seen the access logs the night before, or rather the part of the logs I was still allowed to see. One entry, one login, one elevated credential used at 02:17 a.m. A credential that was never supposed to be used manually, certainly not without dual authorization, and absolutely not without the fail-safe controls that the COO had disabled himself. They didn't just break the system. They broke the safety nets around the system, and then acted surprised when the fall hurt. By noon, chaos had fully bloomed. Clients were calling, transactions sat in limbo, schedules were off by hours. The break hadn't been catastrophic, not yet, but it was the kind of break that grows teeth if ignored. The COO called an emergency meeting. He strode in fast. Fake calm stretched across his face. We're experiencing a temporary delay due to overnight maintenance. A lie. A stupid one. I could see IT flinch. Then he said the words that made my jaw tighten. We'll need all hands reporting progress. Compliance and finance teams will assist operations. He meant me. Of course he did. When things break, the unnecessary guy suddenly becomes necessary again. I kept my expression neutral. I took the seat in the corner. He didn't look at me, but he felt the weight of my presence. Every leader does, when the person they dismissed becomes the person they need. Operations began presenting. Screens showed error chains they couldn't trace. Then legal confirmed what I already suspected. The incident triggered an automatic audit by our external partner because the disruption affected regulated workflows. That room went silent in a way I've only heard in hospitals and boardrooms. The COO tried to salvage control. Let's stay focused. This is solvable. But the IT director leaned forward. Slow, tired, and very, very serious. The credential used last night bypassed every layer of protection we had. There are no secondary logs, no PKI trace, nothing. That happens only when the fail-safe structure is disabled. You could feel the temperature shift. Every director in that room understood the implication, and every one of them knew who had insisted on disabling that fail-safe. The COO shot him a look sharp enough to cut metal, but the IT director didn't flinch. He wasn't trying to blame anyone. He was describing physics. Remove the brakes. The car doesn't stop. He added quietly, the only documentation we have left about the original control environment is whatever he built. He nodded. At me. Dozens of eyes shifted my way, not with respect, not yet, with fear, because they finally sensed the truth. The problem wasn't a bug. It was a consequence. I opened my notebook, yes, the same one they mocked for years, and placed it on the table. Page after page of signatures, timestamps, screenshots, risk flags, every change they approved, Every safeguard they dismantled. Every warning I gave. Nobody breathed, not even the COO. This is the full record, I said, including the access escalation and the authorization chain for the credential used at 02-117 this morning. The IT director exhaled. Relief, gratitude, maybe even guilt. Legal leaned forward like she'd found an oxygen tank in a smoke-filled room. The COO straightened his tie. You kept documentation we didn't ask for. His tone was accusing. Mine was calm. You asked me to simplify, not delete. Someone in operations stifled a laugh. That was the moment I realized something in the room had shifted. People weren't afraid of me. They were afraid for themselves. Because the controls I built weren't just guardrails. They were the only thing keeping all of them from being accountable for mistakes they didn't even know were happening. The COO ended the meeting abruptly, claiming next steps coordination. But the directors stayed behind, not by instruction, by instinct. They looked at me with a kind of openness I hadn't seen in months. Not trust yet. Recognition. And under that recognition, something else grew quietly. They thought I was gone. I wasn't. The audit team arrived the next morning. Not the external partner yet. That would come later, and everyone in the building knew it. But our internal audit and controls unit. The same people who used to rely on my frameworks, who'd send me messages like, "Can you walk us through this logic again? Your flag caught something we missed. Thank you. This saved us 2 days." Now they entered the floor like firefighters stepping into a smoking hallway. Not running, not panicking, just alert. And the first thing they asked for? Full documentation of the controls environment before the redesign. The COO's expression tightened, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. But I saw it. A micro flinch. The kind of reaction people have when they realize the story they've been selling is about to meet its first witness. He answered quickly. We don't have that version anymore. It was phased out. We've been operating under a new structure. The audit lead turned to me. Is that correct? He knew the answer. Everyone did. I didn't drag it out. I have the full original set, and the changelog, and the authorization chain for each removal. Audit nodded slowly, not surprised, not impressed, just relieved that something still made sense in a situation that clearly didn't. They asked to see my files. The COO tried to interject. Let's coordinate the review later. Audit didn't even acknowledge him. Conference room 4B, the lead said. We'll start there. That was the moment it cracked. Not the system, not the workflow, not the technology. The illusion. The COO had built his image on speed, efficiency, cutting fat. But now the cuts had names, timestamps, signatures, and consequences. And the more the audit team saw, the clearer the pattern became. At 9:47 a.m., the audit lead looked up from my documentation and said a sentence that made the room still. This wasn't simplification. This was risk escalation. The COO's jaw tightened again. This is unnecessary framing. One access mistake does not define an entire strategy. Audit didn't argue. They didn't need to. They had the logs. They asked IT for server-level traces, and what came back was exactly what I feared, and exactly what the COO hoped no one would understand. One login had triggered a chain that was never meant to run without the failsafe. One action had propagated across multiple systems because the isolation controls were disabled. One mistake had become many because the walls that used to contain it were gone. When everything had been in place, the incident would have stopped at the first gate. It would have been isolated, logged, reversed, and handled without a ripple. But now it spread like water through cracks. The more they pieced together, the clearer it became. The system didn't fail on its own. It failed because they amputated the parts designed to prevent exactly this. Around noon, the COO called for a private sidebar. Something strategic. Audit didn't follow him. They followed me. The lead asked, "When you warned about the failsafe removal, how did you communicate it?" I showed him the memo, the timestamp ticket, the follow-up note. the acknowledgement. He read every line. And then he asked the question that quietly shifted everything. Did they give you a reason for rejecting your recommendation? I hesitated, not for drama, but to choose the exact truth. They said, "We trust our people," and that the controls created friction. A soft exhale went round the table. Not anger, not mockery. Something closer to disappointment. The kind adults feel when a preventable mistake harms everyone except the person who insisted on making it. Another question followed. In your assessment, what is the likelihood this happens again if the environment stays as is? I didn't sugarcoat it. High. High as in inevitable. They didn't write that down. They didn't have to. It lived in the air already. Then something happened that I didn't expect. Not because it was unrealistic, but because it was human. The audit lead put his notebook aside and looked directly at me. You built something they didn't value, and now they understand it only because it's gone. He wasn't praising me. He was acknowledging a truth that every person in my kind of work carries like a second spine. No one sees the value of prevention until the absence of it hurts. Around 2 p.m., operations joined the meeting. They brought numbers, delays, backlogs, compensation estimates, client dissatisfaction projections, and then they added something else. We found the origin of the 02:17 a.m. access. The room held its breath. It pulled up the trace. Names, roles, access approvals, all legitimate, all authorized, all exactly as the COO had designed the new structure. No malicious intent, no hacking, no sabotage. Just a poorly structured, overly elevated credential with no guardrails, used by someone on the night shift who had no idea the system could no longer contain the ripple. A mistake created by leadership, carried out by an employee who trusted the system. Discovered too late. Someone at the table whispered, "This never would have happened under the old controls." I didn't say it. I didn't have to, because everyone knew. And as I watched the COO's polished confidence begin to fracture, tiny cracks, spreading slow but steady, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to think before. I had been trying to save a system that didn't want saving. I had spent years protecting people who didn't want protection. They wanted shortcuts, speed, simplicity, and now that simplicity had a price. But what none of them knew, not yet, was that the real cost hadn't arrived. Not yet, because the external audit. That was still on its way. The external auditors arrived 3 days later. Not the polite, checklist-driven team companies get during routine annual reviews. No, these were the specialists. The ones they send only when a disruption touches regulated workflows, client funds, or anything with a potential to ripple upward toward governance. The moment they stepped onto our floor, the entire division inhaled as one. It straightened up. Legal cleared calendars, operations abandoned, business as usual. And the COO, the same man who'd mocked redundant controls, tried to look like someone who embraced transparency. He didn't realize yet that transparency is a blade, not a shield. The lead external auditor introduced herself without theatrics. Calm voice, measured steps, zero wasted motion. She asked for one thing within the first 15 minutes. Baseline documentation of the previous control environment. The COO answered quickly, too quickly. That environment was deprecated. We've already transitioned to a more efficient structure. The auditor blinked once, no reaction, no approval, just calculation. Then she turned to me. We were told you maintained comprehensive change logs. May we review your documentation? This time the COO reacted visibly, a small, sharp breath through his nose, but he couldn't stop it. He had already lost authority over the narrative the moment the internal audit flagged risk escalation. I didn't posture, I didn't gloat. I simply handed her the binder and the digital archive. She flipped through the first few pages with a precision that made everyone else in the room suddenly check their posture. After a few seconds, she said quietly, "This is extremely thorough. Thank you." That was the first moment anyone in leadership realized something important. Not about me, but about themselves. The person they'd sidelined had just become the most credible source in the investigation. The COO tried to regain footing. If we can stay focused on the root cause, but the auditor was already writing. Root causes usually grow from decision chains. We will examine all of them. Decision chains. The very thing he'd hoped would stay buried. They began interviews. One by one, directors, managers, analysts, IT leads sat down with the audit team, and the same pattern emerged in every session. The controls removal wasn't reckless, it was deliberate, signed, approved, executed without risk mitigation. Not one person could claim ignorance. By noon, the auditors requested a full sequence reconstruction. IT pulled logs. Ops provided timestamps. Legal provided the compliance matrix. I provided the before and after environment maps. And when all of it appeared on the large screen in the conference room, the truth landed with a quiet, heavy finality. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't maintenance. This wasn't one misguided login. This was a structural collapse caused by leadership decisions. The COO's decisions. The audit team didn't accuse him. That wasn't their job. But they didn't need to. The evidence formed its own argument. And then came the turning point. Around 3 p.m., the auditor asked IT to expand on the credential used at 02:17 a.m. They displayed the hierarchy, the access level, the overrides inherited when the failsafe was disabled. Then the auditor asked calmly, "Under the original structure, could this credential have triggered this chain reaction?" It answered without hesitation, "No, it would have stopped at the second gate. That gate no longer exists." The auditor nodded and looked directly at the COO. "Who authorized the removal of the second gate?" He hesitated, just for a moment, but long enough that even the directors shifted in their seats. Then he tried the only door he had left. "It was a team decision." Silence spread across the room. Not loud, not angry, just razor sharp, because everyone understood what he was implying, and everyone understood it wasn't true. The auditor turned to me. "Your documentation indicates the change was requested by the COO's office and approved by the COO himself." She said it without emotion, without judgment, as a fact. Facts have a way of stripping people bare. The COO opened his mouth, maybe to explain, maybe to deflect, but a notification chimed on the big screen. It froze. Legal leaned forward. The auditor raised her hand to pause the conversation. The message was from our largest client, a formal inquiry, requesting clarification for the processing delays. Operations looked panicked. Legal inhaled sharply. The auditor simply asked, "When was the last time this client experienced a disruption under the previous environment?" Operations answered quietly, "Never." The word echoed, "Never." 27 months of uninterrupted service under the old structure. 3 days after the redesign, a disruption severe enough to trigger regulatory level attention. And that was the first moment the COO lost the room completely. He knew it. We all knew it. Then the auditor did something I'll never forget. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was surgical. She closed my binder and said, "We will reconvene with the board. Not leadership, not the division. The board." The COO's face drained, because when the auditors speak to the board, it means one thing. They've already concluded the failure wasn't technical, it was managerial. After they left, the room emptied slowly, like people were afraid sudden movement might trigger another collapse. I stayed behind, not by choice, by gravity. The COO approached me, not angry, not arrogant, not even defensive. Just small, shrunken. "You didn't have to give them everything," he said quietly. I looked at him. I wasn't emotional, I wasn't vengeful, just tired. "You removed the controls," I said, "not the facts." He was still searching for some kind of dignity when the head of legal stepped back into the room. "Board wants to see us," she said. "Now." His eyes closed for half a second. Mine didn't, because I already understood what this moment really was. They thought I was the safety net, but I was just the person who built it. And when someone tears apart their own protections, the fall belongs to them, not the one who tried to stop it. But the fallout, that was still ahead, and it was going to be loud. The board convened at 8:00 a.m. sharp, not in the main conference hall, not in a casual briefing room. They chose the executive chamber, the one with the soundproof walls, the recorded minutes, and the kind of chairs designed for decisions that change org charts overnight. I wasn't originally invited. I shouldn't have been. People at my level don't sit in those rooms. But 30 minutes before the meeting, the head of legal walked up to my desk, the same desk I'd been quietly pushed into months ago. "You're coming with us," she said. The COO stood 10 feet away. He heard it. He didn't object, because he couldn't. We walked in together. Directors, legal, audit, IT, and him. The board members entered last. 7 people who didn't care about office politics or egos. They cared about exposure, liability, contracts, and the chain reaction of a single breach. The chairwoman opened the meeting without ceremony. "We have reviewed the initial audit report. We will now examine the decision chain." Her tone wasn't angry. It wasn't dramatic. It was clinical, which is much worse. The external audit team presented first, slide by slide, sequence by sequence, original control structure, approved changes, authorization signatures, removal timestamps, incident logs, ripple effects, client impact, regulatory exposure, no opinions, no emotions, just data. Then came the moment everyone felt coming, the question the entire company had been orbiting for a week. The chairwoman asked, "Who authored the redesign of the control environment?" The COO swallowed. He started a rehearsed line about collaboration, cross-functional alignment, and strategic efficiency. The audit lead interrupted, politely but unmistakably. "The documentation indicates the redesign was initiated, requested, and approved by the COO." Then she slid my binder across the table. A physical object always hits harder than a PDF. It landed with a soft thud that carried more weight than any argument could. The chairwoman flipped through it. Her face didn't move. Not anger, not sympathy. But the silence in the room grew dense. She asked one more question. "Did you receive any internal warnings about risk escalation?" The COO opened his mouth, but I was already sliding the memo forward. Dated, signed, acknowledged, ignored. He looked at it like it was written in a language he didn't understand. The board did. One member leaned back and asked legal, "In your assessment, what is our exposure if the system remains in its current structure?" Legal didn't hesitate. High risk, unacceptable, potentially catastrophic. Then they turned to IT. "Can the system be restored to a stable environment?" It nodded. "Yes, but it requires reinstating the original framework." The chairwoman raised her eyes to me. "Can you lead the restoration?" I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I just nodded once. "Yes." The COO exhaled, a shaky, relieved breath, like he thought he had just been saved, but he hadn't understood the question. The chairwoman continued, "Then we will appoint you as interim director of controls until this is resolved." The COO blinked. Interim director. Me. The person he had sidelined. The person he mocked. The person he reduced to unnecessary friction. He tried to speak. "Madam Chair, may I clarify?" But she wasn't finished. "We are placing you as COO on administrative review, effective immediately." The room didn't gasp. It didn't need to. The COO stared at her, then at the board, then at the binder in front of him, the one he had tried to erase from the company's memory. "Please surrender your access credentials to IT," the chairwoman added. Then almost kindly, "There will be a follow-up meeting." Everyone in the room understood what that meant. He would not be returning to his office. He stood slowly. His suit suddenly looked too big for him. He placed his badge on the table. Then, for the first time since he arrived at the company, he looked at me directly, not with arrogance, not with anger, with something closer to disbelief. "You documented everything," he said quietly. I answered just as quietly, "That was my job." He left the room. No applause, no humiliation, just consequences. When the door closed, the meeting continued. We mapped the recovery steps. We rebuilt the matrix. We restored the fail-safes. We updated the audit protocol. I explained each component calmly, without bitterness. Not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because I finally understood something I hadn't been willing to admit. I wasn't fixing his mistakes. I was taking back stewardship of the thing I built. By late afternoon, the remediation plan was approved. By evening, I was given access again. Real access, not the neutered version they'd left me with. For the first time in months, the system made sense again. As people left for the day, the head of audit stopped by my new office. Temporary, but mine. "You know," he said, "some people build careers on visibility. Others build structures that outlast them." He paused. "You built something that saved us twice. Don't let anyone call that unnecessary again." I didn't answer right away, not because I was emotional, though I felt something close to it, but because I was processing the weight of what had happened. I had spent months feeling like a ghost in my own division. Invisible. Dismissed. Ignored. But it wasn't invisibility. It was foundation. People don't look at foundations until something cracks. But when they do, they finally see the thing that held everything up. That night, as I walked to the parking garage, the building behind me glowed in the dark. Humming, stable, recovered. A few days later, HR called with a formal letter. The COO had resigned. No drama, no speech, just a quiet exit. And 2 weeks after that, the board made my interim role permanent. Not because they liked me, not because they pitied me, but because I was the only one who understood the system deeply enough to protect it. The promotion came with a new office, a higher salary, more authority, but the real reward wasn't the title. It was the silence, not empty silence, not ignored silence. The silence of a system that finally worked the way it should, because someone had cared enough to build it right. For the first time in years, I sat in my office, looked at the dashboards, stabilizing, and felt something simple and solid. Peace. They called my controls unnecessary. They learned the hard, expensive way that nothing is more necessary than the things you never notice when they're working. And I learned something too. I wasn't the friction. I was the function. And this time, no one would forget it.